For movies and TV shows, most Americans are very familiar with hearing the phrase, "You have the right to remain silent." However, before it gained its place in American pop culture, it was just a result of a Supreme Court ruling, Miranda v. Arizona, whose intent was to inform citizens of their rights before they were questioned. Miranda v. Arizona became one of the most famous Supreme Court cases to date, but the question remains, to what extent did it actually change the relationship between citizens and their government? This documentary will explore this question, looking at it from a psychological, sociological, and political perspective. The Supreme Court case actually addressed 4 separate cases, each involving custodial interrogations. In the first case, Miranda v. Arizona, Ernesto Miranda was arrested for the rape and kidnapping of an 18-year-old girl. After being interrogated for 2 hours, Miranda signed a written confession. During trial, the confession was presented to the jury, and Miranda was found guilty, sentenced to 20 to 30 years in prison. Miranda appealed, and the Supreme Court of Arizona ruled against him, saying that his rights had not been violated. The second case, Vignera v. New York, involved the arrest of Vignera, who was suspected of the robbery of a dress shop. He admitted to robbery after being taken to 2 different detective squads and was placed under arrest. He was then taken to the assistant district attorney, who interrogated him in front of a journalist who transcribed the questioning. Both the confession and interrogation transcript were used against Vignera in court, and he was sentenced to 30 to 60 years in prison. The Court of Appeals affirmed his conviction without opinion. In the third case, Westover v. United States, Westover was arrested by Kansas City police as a suspect for 2 local robberies, and later they received a message from the FBI saying that Westover was wanted on a felony charge in California. The local police interrogated Westover that night and the next morning before handing him over to the FBI, who interrogated him for 2.5 hours, before Westover signed separate confessions prepared by the FBI. These statements were used at trial, and Westover was convicted for each of the counts. Similar to Vignera, the Court of Appeals affirmed his conviction. In the final case, California v. Stewart, Stewart was arrested on suspicion of purse snatching and killing one of the victims. After being interrogated 9 times, Stewart admitted to the crime, but said that he hadn't meant to hurt the victim. His statements were included at trial, and he was convicted of robbery and first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The Supreme Court of California reversed this decision, deciding that Stewart should have been advised about his right to counsel and to remain silent. In each case, the defendant was not warned of their rights before being questioned, and ended up giving incriminating statements even though they could just simply remain silent or consulted with a lawyer. Brought in front of the Supreme Court in 1966 under the rule of Chief Justice Earl Warren, Miranda v. Arizona achieved a majority 5-4 decision, with the court declaring that any confessions made without the defendant being warned of their rights prior could not be used at trial, as it is not a voluntary confession. Nicknamed the Miranda rights, police must read something along the basis of this warning before questioning. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to talk to a lawyer and have him present with you while you're being questioned. If you cannot afford to hire a lawyer, one will be appointed to represent you before any questioning if you wish one. The defendant is asked 2 questions. Do you understand each of these rights I've explained to you? Having these rights in mind, do you wish to talk to us now? The ruling in Miranda v. Arizona led to great controversy. Politically, many conservatives were opponents of the ruling, with Richard Nixon criticizing it during his 1968 presidential campaign, declaring, "Our courts have gone too far in their decisions weakening the peace forces against the criminal forces in the United States of America." Nixon was just one of many who believed that it was pro-criminal. The chief of the Tulsa Police Department sent a letter to Thurgood Marshall, Solicitor General at the Department of Justice, writing that he was concerned about the trend towards prohibiting any questioning of suspected criminals, and his hope that America will return to a system that concerns itself with the protection of society and the rights of victims of crimes as well as the rights of the individual. The timing of this ruling was also a concern for many citizens, as the 1960s were characterized by Cold War tensions. One woman sent an Impeach Earl Warren postcard to the Supreme Court, criticizing the court's decision as pro-criminal and pro-communist. A man wrote a letter with similar grievances, writing, If we continue to have decisions that protect the suspected criminal and tie the hands of our law enforcement officers with never a thought to protecting society and the innocent victims of these atrocious crimes, the Russians can take over this country without a war. These concerns about the government becoming pro-criminal made a lot of citizens less trusting of the American government. The Miranda v. Arizona ruling also had effects on American society. Up until then, law enforcement had a lot of power over those who they arrested. After Miranda, law enforcement lost their power to extract an involuntary confession during interrogation, while citizens gained the safety of never having to give an involuntary confession. This had the sociological effect of raising the powers of citizens and lowering the power of the law enforcement, a part of the U.S. government. Many were also worried that defendants would give less confessions, making them harder to try, and therefore letting more criminals walk free in society. One self-described liberal sent a letter to the Supreme Court writing, "Your decisions will do nothing but permit rapists, persons molesting minor children, murderers, robbers, and burglars to have an opportunity to escape any punishment for their crimes." The Miranda decision impacted the relationship between the citizens and the government twofold. Taking away power from law enforcement and giving power to the citizens changed their power dynamic, and that change made many citizens angry at the government out of fear of an increasingly criminalized society. Finally, Miranda v. Arizona had psychological effects. First of all, many in law enforcement felt angry and attacked by the courts, who made it sound like law enforcement was always trying to trick the defendant and use unfair means to achieve a confession. And secondly, those who were being interrogated could now be sure that they would know all of their rights before deciding whether or not to talk. These psychological effects benefited the citizen rather than the government. As of today, it is still disputed whether Miranda v. Arizona has achieved what it was intended to do. There is conflicting evidence and no consensus from experts. Despite that, the case Miranda v. Arizona moderately changed the relationship between citizens and the government, as it created a new standard procedure that gave the citizens more power than they used to have and lessened the power of law enforcement. Numerous laws have been passed in attempts to end Miranda, with the most recent being in 2010. But, whether we like it or not, Miranda will continue to loom over America as one of the most controversial of landmark cases in Supreme Court history.